it's such a pleasure for me to do this session because I get the pleasure of introducing Dr. Tade Thompson, as you can see, who is a consultant psychiatrist with expertise in liaison psychiatry and also an author. He is a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. And he has, on top of that, as if it's not enough, he also has a postgraduate qualification in social anthropology. Tade's best-known books are Rosewater, but the one that we're going to talk the most about today is this one, which is called Far from the Light of Heaven. And he lives and works in the south coast of England, and I suppose that's where you're connecting to us today.
That's correct, yes.
Excellent. So please, everyone, a small round of applause, because we're tiny to him, but a big, noisy round of applause for Tade.
Thank you.
So, as a bit of an icebreaker, before we get into the more serious questions, my first question to you is, what were your thoughts when an email from us, from here at the AIUK, landed in your inbox?
My thoughts were, do they know what my opinion is on this? Have they made some kind of mistake? But I gave it a look. I was like, fine. A colleague of mine who I actually worked directly with, Faith Endeavor, had actually been here before. She'd given a Royal College lecture on AI in psychiatry, and I think she's met you specifically. Basically, she lent you all an aura of authenticity. So that made me look closer and everything. And then I had a conversation with you, at which point I said, look, here's what I think. Are you sure you want me here? And that went well. So I think, okay, yeah, fine. I'm here. So, yeah.
We're very thankful for you to join us. We cannot guarantee that Tade is not an AI because, it's on the screen. So as far as we know, there's no comments on that sense. But we will get into it. Maybe we'll do some capture or something. So let's go into the more... sorry, everyone. There's going to be I have a few questions prepared, but there is a chance for Slido for you to ask questions if at some point you want to ask Tade something. So, how does the current technology that exists in the world influence the way you create all of these worlds in your books?
Well, there are two ways of answering that. The first way of answering that is to wonder how does it affect how I actually through the process of writing, and the other one is how does it affect what I am writing? So I think the first one is easiest. It doesn't affect it at all. I try to write in a way that is most as analog as possible. I write, longhand on paper. And one of the reasons I do that is because I'm very distractible. If I see anything shiny, I want to see it. If I see any notifications, I want to go and look at them. So I can't concentrate usually with technology. So what I do is I just basically do all my first drafts on paper. My room is full of notebooks and loose sheets and sticky notes. So I do everything on that and then I transcribe it. When I'm transcribing, I don't care about notifications because I've done most of the heavy lifting creatively anyway, and I just use as basic tools as possible. I don't update my technology according to what's happening. I don't even use the latest version of Word. I use Word 97 on a computer that is not connected to the internet deliberately. It's a nice antique. It uses Windows 8.1, so it's not connected. I kind of write on it and then I transfer it with the USB stick to my more modern laptop when I want to send it to my agents and everything. But what I found is that less technology is better for personal creativity. So the second part of the question would be, how does it affect what I am writing? Now, we are people who live in the world, therefore, by we, I mean anybody who's creating anything at all, filmmakers, writers, artists, anything. So whatever is topical will permeate somehow into our imagination and will come out in that manner. And even with AI being such a hot topic right now, the thing about it is that in science fiction, we've always had AGI, that is artificial general intelligence. We've kind of had that, I think, ever since we've had robots. So it's already been one of those things that we assume. Just like, for example, faster than light travel and Einstein-Rosen bridges. We've always assumed certain things are conventions of the genre, like, okay, we can't write about spaceships if it's going to take them 10,000 years to get to their destination. So we have to find a way that doesn't exist now, but will possibly exist maybe. So a lot of the questions about AGI, for example, have really been answered by Asimov in his robot series, because all the robots had what we would now term AGI. So a lot of them, if you read a lot of Asimov, a lot of the philosophical questions about them have even questions about, okay, well, what does it do to the rest of the human race? If you've got robots doing everything that you could possibly have done, then how does everybody else live? What happens to their jobs, and so on and so forth? So the question of AI is not a new one for most writers of science fiction, I would say. Even the idea, for example, of taking all the information or data that a person has when they die and then creating a virtual version of them, that has already existed in terms of storytelling. So it's existed. I even remember, like 10 years ago, me and a bunch of colleagues wrote a kind of joint round robin story about that kind of thing happening. So it's not new. I think this is a case of society catching up with us, I guess.
So, I mean, there's lots of parts of science fiction that we hope doesn't happen, like the bleak sometimes. Thank you so much, because that's quite interesting, and you've jumped a bit into one of the next questions that I had. But you showed us, before we get that you showed us a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, let's say, of how you write your books. But how do you actually research? Because I guess you're an academic. So does research to a new book is similar, different to an academic research?
So academic research, you would, at least if it's done right. I'll tell you what it should be, and I'll tell you what a lot of people do. So academic research should start with a question. You should start with a thing you want to investigate. Does gravity exist, for example? So you're going to start with that's your hypothesis, and you're going to start with a null hypothesis. You're going to try to prove that gravity doesn't exist. So if you can't prove that gravity doesn't exist, which is the null hypothesis, then you have to accept the alternative hypothesis, which is there is gravity. So you start with the question, okay, gravity doesn't exist, how can I prove that? And then you do a literature search, and all of that. So you start looking for stuff. Now, what happens in many cases of research, even academic research, is that people gather a wide variety of data, and then they analyze that data looking for patterns, and then they formulate the research question, and then they write the paper. That's what a lot of people kind of sneakily do, and we kind of pretend it doesn't happen, but it does. But when you're writing fiction, you can't tell what is going to be useful, what is not going to be useful. So, for example, the book Far From the Light of Heaven, it's really my first actual space, it's my first actual space novel. So I didn't want to draw on the conventions of science fiction for my source material, which I've obviously read a lot of science fiction, but I wanted to read more about what is actual space travel like. So I started out reading the transcripts of the telemetry from the Apollo missions. I read Chris Hadfield's accounts of being in the ISS. I watched tons of actual videos of launching and not launching. I read about orbital mechanics. I did all of that. Now, while I was doing all of that, it was all stewing in my head. So I was picking out bits of it that would be interesting in terms of a narrative. And the usual thing that happens is that, okay, yes, here's what I'm going to write about, and here's the travel and all of that. Now I need characters, I need people who want to do something that is interesting, because that's what fiction is. You're writing about characters that are interesting, otherwise it fails. So I kind of came up with my characters, and then one thing that had always interested me was how the pulse of the Apollo astronauts, even when things were going wrong, didn't really change much. I was like, okay, so they've overtrained about danger such that they're not reacting how I would have reacted, which would be blind panic. They just kind of like, yeah, okay, there's a bit of a problem here. We've lost this or we've lost that, and so on. So I wanted to, my main character, who's an astronaut, Michelle Campion, I wanted her to be able to remain calm. And I remember that I had an argument with my editor because a lot of the things, when you're writing, there are three things you have to do with a character. The character has to do things, the character has to think about those things that they've done, and then they have to feel something about what they've done. That's what you find in a good book. They will have at least those three things happen to them. Now, the problem is that the astronaut wasn't feeling what they would normally expect a main character to be feeling. And I'm like, well, no, because I looked at telemetry, that doesn't often happen with astronauts. They don't have that blind kind of panic that we have. They have a plan for plans that go, awry. They know things and they know things to do and all of that. So we had an argument. She was like, well, yes, but this is fiction, so you have to make it heightened. And therefore, I said, no, she's an astronaut. She's going to behave like astronauts behave and everything. So I won the argument, and that's how she kind of came across. But in the end, the story that came to my mind had a lot to do with Edgar Allan Poe's story, which was kind of sort of the first detective-ish story. And that's really what I used as a template for the novel itself. And once I had that template, everything else kind of fell into place. So the research started slotting itself into aspects of that story, and that's how I finished the book.
Thank you. That was a beautiful segue into, as if you know what my next question is going to be. Excellent. Just a reminder to everyone in the room, if you want to ask questions, there's Slido. I imagine you've been given instructions of how to access Slido. Cool. So as you're talking about Far From the Light of Heaven book, which I don't know if you can see, I have it here, I'm waving it around so people can see. And it is, a locked room mystery, as you mentioned, with, space, and there's some artificial intelligence characters, right? My first question related to this is, how did you evolve? I'm trying to not give too many spoilers, but how did you evolve the differentiation between the different type of artificial intelligence characters that you have? There you go. A little bit of a hint for the audience here that there is more than one type of AI. So how did you evolve the distinction between them?
Okay, so the first thing is it's a situation of to a hammer everything is a nail. So my primary qualification is as a doctor, therefore I think biologically very often. So the first thing I thought is like, if we're going to have AGI, all right, no matter what it is, well, okay, a little bit of digression into the human brain. We have basically, and if there are any neurologists in the room, they're going to hate me for this, but we have basically two kinds of brain. We have the conscious brain that we tell to do stuff and we query for information and we try to solve problems with. And then we have the unconscious brain, which is like the automatic brain, which is essentially your brainstem and your spinal cord, which do things without you knowing. For example, breathing or your heart beating, stuff like that. Now, you can control your breathing with your conscious mind if you want to. You can do that deliberately, but otherwise, if you don't attend to it, it will continue without you knowing. Now, the idea is that, okay, there are two parts of the brain. Stuff that you don't need to be using processing power for is going on in the background automatically, like digesting your food. Imagine if you drank water and then you had to concentrate to make the water get absorbed into your body. It would take up too much of your time. So to save cycles, computer cycles, using computer science analogy, your body does all these automatic stuff without you having to worry about it. So I figure, okay, if there's going to be AGI, and it would depend on what you need the AGI to do, or what, how they would exist. So for example, if they were just small robots that needed to do maintenance of a spaceship, you don't need them to be thinking too much. You just need them, look, go to this pipe and make sure that there are no obstacles within the pipe. If any kind of calcification starts to build up, scrape it off. But make sure that this entire pipe is painted. That may be the job of one small robot. So their job is, x-ray the pipe, and then when they see any irregularities, go in, scrape the irregularity off, come back out again. That's all they have to do. They don't need higher functions for that. It's not poetry. So there are those. And then there are others, depending on what task they are needed for, they will have more and more complexity. Now, the highest complexity of AGI that I had in my book were autonomous. They were autonomous spaceships. Now, autonomous spaceships they're not new. They're not a new concept in science fiction. However, what I did is I divided their brains into essentially the divisions that human beings have. So they've got the automatic brain that does all the functions, like making sure that there's oxygen, life support is going on, all of the stuff that you don't. I basically modeled it after a human being having stuff that doesn't need to be attended to. And then having the higher brain, which is capable of lying. It's capable of having a personality, right? And I gave each higher intelligence their own personality. And that's essentially what I did. Yeah, that's essentially how I came up with the idea of AGI within this book. So some of them are actually like human beings. They have bodies like human beings, and therefore I gave them personhood because they had bodies like human beings and intelligence like human beings, and they had opinions and they had their own preferences, which are very much like human preferences. I gave them autonomy.
This is super interesting because you also expand a little bit on this point on your short story that you also published called The Flaming Imbusen. I hope I said that properly. I think we've all had that sci-fi of reading a name and then having to pronounce it out loud. So I apologize if I didn't pronounce it properly.
It's actually a Japanese term. It's a Japanese martial arts term. It refers to the path you go along when you're performing a kata in karate.
Oh, excellent. So my question regarding that is, so what point do you think that it would be a turning point to start considering AI? Do you think it's the having AI as in giving, like in your characters, giving them personhood? Do you think it's the having a body or having the feelings, or just a mixture of both in the end?
Okay, so it's not the idea of the body itself. Although in humanity, there's a whole different, especially in anthropology, there's a whole different term of, embodied humanity and all of that. That's a whole different conversation that would take us a week to talk about. But I think that I have to say again, I'm a skeptic here. It's strange. I'm a skeptic here. But if AGI were possible, it would mean that we would have an entity that could think for itself and have opinions. I think that if you have an entity that could think for itself without input from an external agency, then you would have to consider, I say you, but I mean we, would have to consider personhood. We would have to consider that. And that's one of the things I did in that short story, which is to have two AGIs, but coming from different societies. So one society does have personhood for their AGIs, and the other society does not. And the two of them have an accident, well, it's not really an accident, a manufactured accident, where what now has to be done with each one depends on where they're from. So if you steal a spaceship, if the spaceship doesn't have personhood, then it's theft. If it has personhood, then it's kidnapping. So the crime depends on the society from which the AGI is from, and that's the problem of that story. That's the primary problem of that story, The Flaming Embassy. That was what it was about. That's what it was meant to explore. Like, okay, how do you do this? What happens when AGIs come from different political contexts, and how do you negotiate a solution in that kind of situation? And it brings up a lot of questions, because personhood in the world that we live in is not equal, one, and two, you will find, or what we will all find, is that probably people will get distracted by the personhood of AGI. If AGI, well, they're already talking about it, even though we don't have AGI, they're already talking about it. People will get distracted by that and spend lots of energy talking about that, while actual human beings don't really have full personhood. Some do, but some don't. Personhood is not that uniform thing. We can sit in our houses and live in a free society and say, we live in a free society, therefore personhood is taken for granted. Well, there are some parts of the world where you're not actually a person until you're about 12. Like, personhood, and this is the anthropologist in me speaking, personhood is negotiated differently in different societies. And personhood can be lost in different societies. There are places where if you are escaping from justice and you touch a particular horn, you are forgiven for all of your ills. Whatever you've done, you'll be forgiven, but you become an outcast in society, and therefore your personhood is the cost of escaping justice, which is a kind of mirror of what happens in the prison system. Like, the personhood is reduced considerably due to sins against society. My fear is that AGI will get full personhood before actual human beings that don't have full personhood do. That is one of my fears.
Thank you. That's a very good point. I mean, it would be an excellent point for society in general if we had equal personhood at this point for all humans, even before getting there. Before we go on to another question, we have a few questions on Slido. I didn't check with the room. Do you all know how to get to Slido and ask questions in this session? I see one nod. I'm taking that as a yes. So if you want, just go there. So the first question that I have from there is from John, and is, do you think that AI researchers and developers should, emphasis on should, try to achieve what the sci-fi world already has, particularly regarding AGI, for example? Okay,
so I'm wary of just using the blanket term AI. I'm very wary of it. If we're talking about Gen AI, LLMs, and the like, which are one thing. There's AGI, which is our nice pie in the sky. Let's forget about the hype or anything like that, all right? I don't think science fiction is a terrible predictor of the future. Terrible. We're so bad at it. But also the futures that we predict, many of them can be horrible just because of hype. Just because it's dramatic. People pay more attention to what is dramatic. And what is dramatic is often negative. Largely because as humans, we have evolved to pay more attention to negative things because survival. So you want to be able to look at a landscape and say, there's a lion in that bush there. So you want to be able to attend to the dangerous things so that it means that you'll survive. I don't think that we, humanity now, should use whatever is in science fiction as a guideline. We are not prophets. We are not people who are speaking as if we have your best intentions in mind. We are trying to create drama or ask interesting questions, but really the answers we come up with have to do a lot with what is dramatic, what is going to sell, what our editors allow, what the director wants, what is visually stimulating, and so on and so forth. It's art. What do we know about what's good for humanity? And one of the things we've noticed, especially in recent years, is that people seem to be finding a future that they seem to have picked out of science fiction and assuming that's a good thing. It's not necessarily so. So I would really, in terms of what directions we should be looking at, I would look for real world people. Like, I would get historians more than anything, philosophers, and lots of lay people who don't have, who don't necessarily have, one of the things I said in this conversation is I said to a hammer, everything is a nail. So because I look at things from the lens of my professionalism or the things I've studied, it gives me a particular viewpoint. And here I'm talking as a science fiction writer, I have a viewpoint. But that doesn't mean that's what's good for society. So you need lots of experts on one hand and lots of lay people on the other hand. And then somewhere amongst those people, the answer will emerge. But science fiction, we're terrible predictors of the future. Terrible.
Well, let's hope so, right? Again, there's some dystopians out there that we should see as fiction, not as guidelines.
And we see the guideline, and we're seeing people using it as guidelines all the time now. That's the sad thing. It is, it is, and we have to think about what we're writing. I think going forward, what we need to write going forward, we need to really examine ourselves, and by ourselves I mean any kind of creative.
Thank you. There's another question for you. Is there the scope for neglecting AGI as a given of sci-fi writing, as Ursula Le Guin does for FTL?
I don't. Could you read that question again? Because I don't think I fully understand the question.
I'll try my best, but I'll try to read it again. The person that asked the question, if you want to expand on it, that would be great. Is there the scope for neglecting AGI as a given of sci-fi writing, as Ursula Le Guin, again, sorry, apologize,
Okay. So
does for FTL?
The short answer is the answer is yes. I mean, for example, I didn't actually use FTL in Far From the Light of Heaven. I didn't use FTL. I basically said, and I was more realistic about this because of my medical background. I basically said, okay, how can a human be kept alive through a journey this distant? And so I gave them IVs, I put catheters in them, I said what happens to their blood, and they don't just wake up out of the sleep. They wake up, they have to have physiotherapy for a long time, you have to stimulate their muscles, the bone wasting, and all of that. I kind of factored all of that in, but that's because of my medical background. So the answer is no, I didn't put FTL in mine either. And maybe it's a coincidence that I quite admire Ursula Le Guin. So
again, beautiful segue, because I'll ask you to change hats now, because we've been talking about your work as a sci-fi author, but you are a consultant psychiatrist, and you've also worked in the NHS as a psychiatrist. Just checking, I was looking at you to see the nod to confirm. So how do you see the impact of AI in this field, and what are your main concerns? So away from sci-fi, but in a more real-world NHS impact.
Okay. So, I have kind of two views about AI use. Now, when it comes to LLMs, I have a big problem with LLMs generally, but in terms of a medical context, I'm actually quite in support of the use of AI. I'm quite in support of the use of machine learning, especially given ethically sourced data and pattern recognition and all of that. I'm actually quite in support of that. Focusing on that, I think that it would be, because there are things to do with assessing. So the person comes with a problem. There's assessing the person to understand what the problem is, and then there is thinking about the solution. In psychiatry, you can definitely have a kind of algorithmic thinking where you ask yourself, if the person gives this answer, then this is what it could be, and this answer, and it narrows options down until you get the final piece of information that narrows it down to a specific diagnosis. Now, you could get that. The problem is that those algorithms depend on adjectives, and those adjectives don't mean the same thing to everybody. And that, even removing AI from the equation, even in interpersonal conversations in psychiatry, that problem already exists. And that's one of the reasons why one of the truisms you'll hear about psychiatry is that, well, they all came up with different answers. One of the reasons they come up with different answers or different diagnoses is because adjectives vary in meaning from person to person. I'm not just talking about the professionals. A person can tell you that something hurts inside and say that it is a kind of, is it that this person is depressed, or are they just sad? Is this your everyday sadness, and so on? Now, we have ways of sorting through that, but all the ways depend on a person's description of what's going on in their mind. We cannot go into people's minds. Therefore, we have to skate the surface and gather the adjectives and kind of make sense out of those adjectives and make a best guess. Now, my problem, or a possible problem, could be, what does an AI system make of those adjectives? Do they take the adjectives on face value and therefore funnel the answer to that direction? All right. How are they going to account for the idiosyncratic, the idiosyncratic language use amongst people? And that's not the only thing. Now, a person's first contact with, and I use alien language deliberately, but a person's first contact with the mental health system is not just a matter of they give information, you give a diagnosis. It's not that. If they have a long-term condition, and a lot of mental health conditions are long-term conditions, that contact determines what their relationship with that service is going to be pretty much for the rest of their life. So, like, you talking to them can do one of two things. It can encourage them to come back, or it can make them run away like, that was such an unpleasant experience, I'm not going back there again, even if you did everything right. So there's that human aspect of the contact with the mental health service that has a lot of impact on what happens next. Now, there are judgments you have to make about, okay, one of the conversations you're going to have, a lot of, is that you're not often going to both agree on what you think is wrong. And that could be fine. But like, if you have an algorithm that is telling you this is the problem, and then with this problem, this is what you need to do, sometimes that's not what you do. Largely because you're thinking of broader things. How am I coming across to this person? Does this person feel intimidated by me? Are they afraid? And will this better be served by sending them away and saying, well, come back, why don't you come back in a month and let's see if this has gotten worse, and then let's talk a little bit more. Sometimes you have to do that, and it is pretty much a judgment call as to whether you do or don't. Now, here's where it gets tricky. If something goes wrong down the line, will, for example, the algorithm that AI uses be used to determine whether, one, there's been malpractice, two, you should have done something different, and three, used to sue the person? Like, well, the AI says you should have done this, you should have listened to the AI, and then because you didn't do what the AI said, blah. Now, as a consultant, we've got nice guidelines, we've got different guidelines for different things that we do. I am allowed to depart from the guidelines because I am an expert. I am allowed to say, okay, I know what the guidelines are, but this is what I'm going to do here. And as long as I justify why I have chosen that path, I will usually be fine. And of course, that may not necessarily happen. We have to be careful. I'm not trying to say that algorithms will be robotic, but I'm trying to say that I often don't trust what they're going to be extrapolated into. It's not, like, the work can be useful, I suppose. It can help, it can make things faster. And this is what I worry about. Algorithms are about efficiency, making things faster. But in that, a lot of the human part of the contact might be lost. And many of us, at least those of us in the UK, may have had a lot of experience of going to the GP practice and they're staring at their screens. It is distancing. And I'm not blaming the GPs because this is what they've been told to do, one, and two, they've only got about 15 minutes, so they're trying to do, I guess, what's the greatest good for the greatest number. So a lot of things can begin to happen as a result of that. I think that, for example, things that have been done in X-rays and in pathology, I think those things are very useful. I think they're very, there are arguments that the results of looking at pathology slides or X-rays are better with machine learning AI than they are with human radiologists sometimes. And that is an argument for people to make, but my brother-in-law is a consultant radiologist, and he says, yeah, they're better. They're very often better than humans. What to do next? Obviously, you can recognize the pathology. What to do next has to be a human decision, but that's kind of where it is. And the problem is that's not going to be as straightforward in psychiatry as it could be. And I think I've rambled a bit, but that's kind of a, so those are kind of my problems. The human element of it, the fact that people don't say exactly what they mean because humans lie.
Yeah.
And it's, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. It's just that people lie sometimes. They have their reasons for it, but people lie. And if the algorithm assumes that they are telling the truth and then finds a solution based on what that truth is, then there are problems that will emerge from that.
Thank you. That's such a good perspective. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. We have about 5 minutes left, so we do need to have apologies, because it's a really interesting conversation, and I would talk to you for much longer, but there's other people to come and occupy the stage. So a couple more questions from the audience. Have you explored the contrast between religious faith or spirituality and AGI? Example, the name of your book, saying Far From Heaven. But again, quick response, please, because I imagine that a question about faith and spirituality can go on.
So there's no short answer to that question. You just kind of that's probably an entire philosophy thesis that you've just kind of put into a question. All I can say is that, yes, human responses to something that appears to be greater than ourselves can often become religious. And religion doesn't have to be that thing that is supernatural. It just refers to the kind of awe and regular kind of worship that we do, or attention that we give to such a thing. So it's not necessarily religious, or so not necessarily supernatural, but we do things in a religious way because it is our way as humans. We worship other humans too. And it's not just humans. Rats do it. I will kind of direct you to the Calhoun experiment. I'll direct you to the Calhoun rat experiment. Like, they also had people that they began to they had rats, individuals that they began to revere as well. I can't go into that, but it's very interesting. And really long. It's a long answer. I can't possibly answer it in this time.
I was going to say, this question is not even the full 5 minutes would have been enough for this question, let alone.
No, it wouldn't have been. But it's a good question. Whoever asked it, I like that question.
And finally, the last question from the Q&A. Again, very quickly, how to balance acknowledging AGI personhood, which means equal treatment in the eyes of the law, etc., with taking into account cognitive and physical power imbalances?
Okay, well, I think I've kind of answered that in a way.
Yeah.
So, like, inequality is built into society, all right? And kind of the answer I was trying to give was that, well, look, we don't even have equality as it is now. So to give, the idea of giving AGI equality is a myth. It's not going to happen, largely because that's just not what society is like. What will probably happen is that the people who end up developing the AGI, if indeed they do, and probably will be people of means, by which I mean billionaires and possible trillionaires, they will be people of means. They will probably promote the idea that they should be given personhood, and they will probably be more equal than than people who are not equal in society right now. They'll probably get that as a result of wealth inequalities that exist now. So in other words, the people who will develop it will already have privilege in society, and they will grant that privilege to AGI when it happens because it favors their needs to do so.
Thank you. Oh, that was such a quick answer. That was excellent. So to finish off, and before we give a big round of applause, can you tell us what is the next project or books or any ideas that you're working on that you can share with us?
Okay, well, look, I have a Doctor Who book coming out probably in August, maybe July or August. There's a small Doctor Who book coming out. I can tell you that it's the fourth Doctor. It's Tom Baker's Doctor. So that's coming out then. And I've got another book called The Apologist, which actually also is about, I don't want to reveal, but it's similar to the things we have discussed here today. It's called The Apologist. We'll see when that comes out. I don't have a date for it yet. And I'm also working on some things for TV, which I can't talk about, but there's a lot in the works. Let's put it that way.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for joining in, even if you're not feeling well. And everyone, a big round of applause for Tade, please. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming.